From the moment the first warning letter arrived, the homeowner sensed something was off. It was delivered in a pristine white envelope, the HOA's logo stamped at the top, a symbol that typically meant trivial reminders about recycling bins or notices about community garage sales. But this one felt different. He opened it slowly, standing on his front porch, and read the accusation. His grass was significantly above HOA-approved length, and he had 72 hours to correct the violation or face an escalating fine. It was an absurd claim, considering the grass was barely an inch taller than the perfectly manicured lawns neighboring his own. It wasn't an overgrown jungle, nor an eyesore, just a little long, the kind of minor lapse that would normally earn a friendly reminder, not a formal threat. He shrugged it off at first. Maybe someone on the board was having a bad week. Maybe they were simply being strict. He cut the grass that evening, made sure it was crisp and neat, and assumed the issue was over. But 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one was harsher. It claimed he had ignored the previous warning and now owed a fine for non-compliance. Confused, he inspected his lawn again. It was trimmed, maintained, even cleaner than that of the HOA president herself. There was no universe in which this was a violation. Yet the letter stated otherwise, as if the HOA were documenting a completely different property. He sent an email disputing the fine, attaching photos of his freshly cut lawn. No response. The following week, yet another fine appeared, this time doubled. Each letter grew more hostile, more mechanical, and more determined to paint him as a reckless resident destroying the aesthetic standard of the neighborhood. The language suggested repeat offenses, escalating violations, and deliberate neglect. None of it was true. The situation felt like a small fire that refused to go out. No matter how many times he doused it with reason, it flared up again. He walked the neighborhood, discreetly comparing his lawn to others. Several homes had grass significantly taller than his, yet none of them had warning signs posted or envelopes taped to their doors. He began to suspect selective enforcement, a quiet favoritism that snaked its way through the community. The HOA president, a clipped and polished woman named Cheryl, seemed to watch him whenever he drove by. Her house sat on the corner with a perfect view of his front yard and driveway. She never waved, never greeted him, only observed. He started to wonder if she had taken a personal interest in him, for reasons he couldn't yet understand. 2 months passed. The fines increased in frequency and severity. He kept a folder of every notice, every email, every photo timestamped for proof. A running tally of the fees suggested he owed thousands, an impossible number considering the alleged violation was nothing more than slightly tall grass. When he tried speaking directly to the board during an open meeting, they dismissed his concerns within minutes. They treated him like a nuisance, a troublemaker disrupting their orderly kingdom. They encouraged him to focus on compliance rather than challenging the process. It became clear that the board had no intention of hearing him out. When the next envelope arrived, thicker than usual, he hesitated before opening it. Inside was a notice of intent. The HOA claimed they were initiating the first steps toward seizing his home to recover unpaid community obligations. His chest tightened as he read the bold text, each sentence dripping with cold authority. The document implied he was months behind on fees, had ignored multiple attempts at resolution, and was now considered a severe rule-breaker. None of it was true. He reread the letter 3 times, pacing across the house, each step fueled by rising disbelief and anger. It was no longer about grass. The HOA was actively manufacturing grounds to take his home. That night, he combed through the HOA bylaws, reading every line like a courtroom attorney. He found nothing that justified the actions being taken against him. The rules clearly required documented evidence, multiple independent inspections, and clear communication, none of which he had received. The more he read, the more obvious it became that the board was bypassing its own procedures. Whether out of negligence or malice, he didn't know. He printed everything: emails, photos, letters, bylaws. The stack grew into a small mountain of documentation. It still felt hopeless. The HOA had power, influence, and the ability to manipulate records. He was just a single homeowner trying to protect his property. It was a neighbor who finally pushed him toward getting help. An older man who had lived in the community for years pulled him aside during a morning walk. He mentioned quietly that other residents had once been targeted too, always one at a time, always for vague violations, always resulting in fines that mysteriously disappeared when people stopped fighting. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested the HOA wasn't enforcing rules, but exploiting them. The neighbor whispered something else before walking away. They pick the ones they think won't fight back. The homeowner went inside, sat down, and made a decision. If the HOA thought he would roll over, they were wrong. The next morning, he scheduled a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. She listened patiently as he showed her everything. She nodded thoughtfully, flipping through the documents, pausing several times as if noticing inconsistencies he hadn't recognized. When she finally spoke, her tone sharpened. She told him that not only was the HOA in violation of its own rules, but several of the fines appeared completely fabricated. Dates didn't align. Photos included in the HOA's evidence were impossible based on weather reports. Some signatures didn't match official board signatures. Timelines contradicted themselves. The more she uncovered in that initial consultation, the more his world shifted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't incompetence. It was something else entirely, something bigger than a petty grass complaint. The lawyer assured him that she could help, but she also warned him that what lay ahead might reveal far more than he expected. HOAs, she explained, had been caught in shady behavior before: misappropriated funds, rigged elections, hidden fees, personal vendettas. His case was showing early signs of deeper issues. As he left her office with a folder of newly organized documents, he felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The situation was escalating, but for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. That night, as he stood outside looking at his perfectly trimmed lawn under the streetlight, he realized that the grass had never been the problem. It had been nothing more than the first tug on a thread that, if pulled hard enough, might unravel everything the HOA had worked so carefully to hide. And with a lawyer now on his side, he was ready to pull. The lawyer wasted no time. Within a week, she had drafted a formal request demanding all records related to the homeowner's alleged violations. According to HOA law, the board was required to provide transparent documentation upon written request. The homeowner expected resistance, but he didn't expect the sheer level of chaos that followed. The HOA delayed, stalled, and claimed the records were being organized. Then they claimed that some documents were misfiled. A few days later, they insisted that an entire month's worth of inspection reports had been lost due to a technical malfunction. The homeowner's lawyer wasn't fooled. She recognized patterns, deliberate obstruction, scrambling, and a frantic effort to rewrite history. The lawyer filed a notice of noncompliance. This time, the HOA produced documents within 48 hours. The homeowner sat across from his lawyer at her office table as she laid out the files. At first glance, they looked official. Forms filled with legal language, timestamps, signatures. But when she placed them beside the homeowner's own records, the truth began to surface like oil rising through water. The dates were inconsistent. Inspection reports claimed his grass had been measured on days when he was out of town, and he had photos proving it. Another report described the grass as 8 inches over community limits. A laughable exaggeration considering the photo attached showed grass barely taller than a sidewalk curb. One notice claimed an inspector had left a door tag, yet the homeowner had security camera footage showing no one had approached his property that day. His lawyer quietly noted each discrepancy. She moved slowly, methodically, as though unraveling a code. It wasn't long before patterns emerged. The violations were all filed by the same board member. Every signature, every report, every complaint. It all traced back to one person: Cheryl, the HOA president. What caught the lawyer's attention next was the financial record of the fines. The ledger listed payments, balances, and outstanding penalties. But some payments appeared to have been applied to accounts that didn't match the homeowner's name. Funds were marked as received, then mysteriously moved, then marked as corrected. The amounts didn't line up. It was accounting sludge. Messy, suspicious, and impossible to justify. The lawyer leaned back, her expression sharpening. She explained that this kind of pattern often suggested misuse of funds or creative bookkeeping, an issue far more serious than a grass complaint. If a board member was inflating violations to generate fines, then shifting money around, the consequences could be severe. Falsified documents, if proven, could invalidate the HOA's authority and could even result in criminal charges. The homeowner felt a mixture of vindication and dread. The problem was no longer just about protecting his property. It was far larger than anything he had imagined. The lawyer advised him to stay quiet. She would send her findings to the board, accompanied by a demand for explanation. She warned him that once the HOA realized the extent of their exposure, they might attempt to intimidate him or push him into a settlement. She urged him not to engage, not to respond to their calls, not to open the door if anyone from the HOA approached. Everything needed to be handled formally, through documented channels. 2 days later, the board called 3 emergency meetings. None were announced to the community, but meetings held in secret had a way of leaving behind clues. Hurried footsteps late at night at the clubhouse, board members parking in back lots, whispered conversations that carried just far enough for neighbors to notice. Rumors began to spread. A few neighbors approached the homeowner with nervous curiosity, asking if he had heard anything. One neighbor whispered that she'd seen board members leaving the clubhouse looking pale and shaken. Another claimed that Cheryl had been shouting into her phone in the grocery store parking lot, insisting that this was blown out of proportion. Someone else quietly mentioned that a board treasurer had resigned suddenly. The homeowner realized something. He wasn't the only one who had felt the HOA's heavy hand. Several neighbors admitted they had been fined for vague offenses too. Trash cans placed a few inches off, porch lights too bright, holiday decorations excessive. Most had paid the fines because they feared escalating conflict. Others said the fines had disappeared without explanation after they threatened to complain publicly. A pattern of abuse was starting to surface, and it didn't stop at grass height. The lawyer contacted the HOA's attorney directly. She outlined every discrepancy, every contradiction, and every suspicious financial record. She stated formally that unless the board rescinded the fines and provided the full unaltered records, she would proceed to file a complaint with the State Housing Authority and petition for a forensic audit of the HOA. Hours after that letter was delivered, the homeowner received an email from the HOA, short, stiff, and strangely urgent. The board offered to clear all fines as a gesture of goodwill and requested he consider closing the matter amicably. They insisted that the violations may have been accidental or misinterpreted. His lawyer told him to ignore it. Then came the knock on his door. He peered through the peephole and saw Cheryl standing on his front porch, stiff-backed and smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. She held a stack of folders in one arm. She knocked again, sharper this time. When no one answered, she slipped a letter under the door and walked away briskly. The letter begged for a meeting. It urged him to work this out before things got unnecessarily messy. It suggested they could reach an understanding, and implied that some of the records in question may have been incorrectly documented by mistake. He forwarded the letter to his lawyer without responding. The board's panic grew more visible with each passing day. The clubhouse lights stayed on deep into the night. Cars came and went at odd hours. By the end of the week, 2 more board members had resigned, both without explanation. The lawyer finally received the full set of financial statements from the HOA's accountant. Hours later, she called the homeowner with a voice tight with controlled urgency. She explained that the accounting records had revealed something far more serious than inflated fines. Money earmarked for maintenance projects was missing. Payments from multiple residents had been rerouted. The financial inconsistencies were not small errors, they were systematic. And every questionable transaction had one thing in common: the same authorization signature. Cheryl's. The lawyer prepared to escalate the case to state authorities. She advised the homeowner that things might accelerate quickly once formal complaints were filed. Investigations could follow. Subpoenas could be issued. The HOA board might dissolve or face legal consequences. The homeowner walked through his quiet neighborhood that evening, noticing how peaceful everything looked. The lawns were trimmed, the houses neatly aligned, the community seemingly perfect. Yet beneath the surface, the HOA that claimed to protect this tranquility had been hiding rot for years. He realized then that this conflict was no longer about him. It was about every resident who had been manipulated, bullied, or forced to pay unjustified fines. If the truth came out, it could free the community from years of corruption. At sunset, he stood on his lawn and watched the shadows stretch across the grass. The same grass that had sparked the entire war. And for the first time, he felt a sense of control. The storm was coming, and the HOA had no idea how unprepared it was. The official complaint was filed at 9:14 a.m. on a Monday morning, and by noon the shockwaves were already tearing through the neighborhood. The State Housing Authority acknowledged receipt almost immediately and assigned an investigator to the case. The HOA board, used to operating in the shadows, suddenly found themselves under a spotlight they could no longer avoid. The first sign of panic emerged when the clubhouse parking lot filled with cars belonging not to residents, but to lawyers. Men and women in crisp suits ushered in and out of the building, carrying thick binders and laptops. From across the street, the homeowner watched as Cheryl stood outside the clubhouse entrance, pacing, her phone glued to her ear. Her usually calculated demeanor was unraveling. She walked in rapid circles, gesturing wildly as she argued with someone the homeowner could only assume was her own attorney. Later that day, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board reading, "Emergency HOA meeting, board members only," but the secrecy couldn't stop what was coming. Word leaked anyway. Neighbors whispered about missing funds, falsified documents, and resignations. One by one, residents began to share their own stories. Overcharged fees, strange fines, ignored complaints, and, in one case, a supposed violation issued for a trash bin placed at the curb while the homeowner was out of the country. People realized they weren't alone. The HOA had been systematically abusing its authority for years. The investigator moved quickly. Within 3 days, subpoenas were issued for financial records, communications, and inspection logs. The HOA's accountant was questioned for hours. The board's treasurer, who had quietly disappeared weeks earlier, became a central figure of interest. And in the midst of all of this, Cheryl found herself at the center of the storm. The homeowner received updates from his lawyer daily. She explained that once an investigation reached this stage, it rarely stopped at surface-level issues. Every questionable transaction, every complaint filed, every recorded violation would be scrutinized. And based on what had been uncovered so far, the board was in far deeper trouble than anyone had imagined. The community conversation quickly shifted from gossip to outrage. Neighbors felt betrayed. The HOA had used its power not to maintain fairness and order, but to bully, exploit, and intimidate. Residents began gathering informally in driveways and on sidewalks, comparing notes and discussing the possibility of removing the entire board. As pressure mounted, cracks appeared. The first board member to break was a soft-spoken man who had always seemed uncomfortable in his role. Late one evening, he visited the homeowner's lawyer's office and provided a statement. He revealed that he had been pressured to sign documents he hadn't fully reviewed, and that Cheryl insisted all complaints be funneled through her for efficient processing. He admitted that several financial inconsistencies had been raised internally but were dismissed. His testimony painted a picture of a board controlled by a single forceful personality, someone who manipulated processes to increase fines, rear out funds, and silence dissent. 2 days later, another board member reached out, this time anonymously, to share copies of internal emails. The messages showed Cheryl instructing the board to push harder on compliance violations, to encourage responsible behavior. But there were also subtler lines insinuating that certain residents, those who questioned the board or attended meetings with complaints, should be monitored more closely. The homeowner's case, once seen as an isolated dispute, had become the catalyst for exposing an entire network of misconduct. The investigator expanded the scope. A forensic accountant was brought in to track the movement of funds. The clubhouse computers were seized. Access cards for board members were temporarily suspended. And the once confident HOA, so quick to issue fines and warnings, now found itself powerless. The collapse became public during a mandatory community meeting held at the clubhouse. Nearly every resident attended. The air was thick with tension as the investigator announced preliminary findings. mismanagement of association funds, falsified violation records, manipulated inspection reports, and improper accounting practices. Gasps rippled through the room. Then came the announcement that several board members were under formal review, and one, whose name no one needed to hear to recognize, was the primary subject of an active investigation. All eyes turned toward Cheryl, who sat rigidly near the front. Her expression was unreadable, her posture stiff. She did not stand up. She did not defend herself. She simply stared forward, as if bracing for an impact she could no longer avoid. Within 24 hours, Cheryl resigned. Her resignation letter, taped to the clubhouse door, was brief, defensive, and devoid of accountability. It cited personal reasons and unfounded accusations. But the community no longer cared about her explanations. They were focused on rebuilding what she had destroyed. The remaining board members resigned shortly after. The HOA was placed under temporary external management until new elections could be held. The state investigation continued quietly in the background, but for the residents, the immediate threat was gone. For the homeowner, the end came with a letter from the state housing authority confirming that all fines had been voided and all claims against him dismissed. The letter also acknowledged that his complaint had been instrumental in exposing the HOA's misconduct. It recommended further legal action if he chose to pursue it, something his lawyer was still considering based on the extent of damages. He stood on his lawn that evening, feeling the calm settle around him. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, perfectly trimmed and impossibly symbolic. It had never been the problem. It had simply been the opening act for a much larger story, one that had uncovered deceit, manipulation, and abuse of power. Over the next weeks, the neighborhood transformed. Residents began talking again, sharing stories, offering apologies if they had once judged him unfairly. A sense of unity grew, built on a shared desire to restore trust and fairness. People who had once avoided HOA meetings now volunteered for committees. Others discussed term limits, transparency rules, and accountability measures to prevent future overreach. The homeowner found himself approached by several neighbors urging him to join the new board once elections opened. He politely declined, preferring peace over governance. But he promised to stay involved just enough to ensure history didn't repeat itself. One quiet morning, he watched as workers arrived to replace the old clubhouse locks, erasing the final physical remnant of the previous regime. It felt like a fresh start for everyone. The investigation into Cheryl continued for months. Rumors circulated about charges related to financial mismanagement and fraud. But the homeowner no longer needed the details. Justice, in its own slow and steady way, was already unfolding in the end. He kept every document, every photo, every letter that had started the battle. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that even the smallest injustice, something as simple as a few blades of grass, could hide something monstrous beneath it. And a reminder that standing up for what was right could change an entire community. The war had started with a lawn, but it ended with accountability.